The Vietnam War lasted 10 years, cost America 58,000 lives, and over $1 trillion adjusted for inflation. It brought down a president, stirred social unrest, and ended in defeat. No one in hindsight believes fighting a losing war is ever worth the cost. Consequently, the Vietnam War is usually written off as a colossal strategic blunder and a humanitarian disaster. Yet historical appraisals might have been much different had the Vietnam War followed the pattern of the Korean War, which the United States fought for almost identical reasons: the defense of freedom in Asia. The U.S. had military advisors in Vietnam during the 1950s, but didn't become involved in a major way until 1963. President John F. Kennedy firmly believed in the domino effect, the foreign policy theory that vulnerable nations without help would fall one after another, like dominoes, to external communist aggression. Kennedy thus hoped to stop Soviet and Chinese-backed communist invasions in the manner President Harry Truman had in Korea by taking a stand in Vietnam. As with Korea, it was a war the United States did not seek. As with Korea, Vietnam presented no imperial advantages, no natural resources, or resources of any kind that the United States needed to protect or wished to obtain. As with Korea, the aggressor was a communist government in the North intent on taking control of the South, and its military crossed an internationally recognized border to do so. Following Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, President Lyndon Johnson vastly escalated America's role in 1964. But even as he did so, Johnson prosecuted the war with deep ambivalence, authorizing significantly more troops and money for the war, but never pushing for total victory. In contrast, the North Vietnamese never wavered. They ignored every one of Johnson's many offers to negotiate a settlement. By 1971, the war was at a stalemate, neither side able to establish a clear advantage. The President, Richard Nixon, pursued a two-pronged strategy: to turn over combat operations to the South Vietnamese and to bomb North Vietnam. The effort brought the Communists to the Paris peace talks, and by 1973 the North agreed to a general settlement, establishing two autonomous Vietnamese nations, one communist, one non-communist, in the manner of North and South Korea. However, the Watergate scandal, the subsequent resignation of President Nixon, and the Democrats' sweeping congressional victory in the 1974 midterm election all helped to convince the North Vietnamese that America would not enforce the peace agreement. They were right. Without U.S. air support and material aid, the South Vietnamese had no chance against the North. Well supplied by the Soviet Union and the Chinese, the Communists gained full control over the country in April 1975. The war proved far more costly than Korea because the geography and landscapes of Vietnam were far more conducive to insurgency operations. There were also far more restrictions placed on American commanders than during the Korean War. And the United States in the 1960s was a far less conservative and cohesive country than America of the 1950s. Yet despite the long ordeal and terrible cost, South Vietnam was saved in 1973, only to be lost in 1975. The U.S. defeat in Vietnam was a political choice, not a military necessity. Had the U.S. protected an independent but vulnerable South Vietnam in 1973 and 4, that country would have most likely followed the model of South Korea. Millions of Southeast Asians would not have become boat people and refugees or have been sent to the gulags and re-education camps. A viable U.S.-backed democratic Vietnam would have stabilized the region and almost certainly prevented the neighboring Cambodian genocide, in which 1/5 of that country, 2 million people, were slaughtered by its communist leadership, and much of the bitterness over the war on both sides of the American political spectrum, still with us today, would have vanished. And for the communist Vietnamese, the instigators and aggressors of the terrible conflict, what was it all for? Today, ironically, the Vietnamese government aspires to nothing more than the capitalist affluence that it once reviled.
Decades back, in late 1972, South Vietnam and the United States were winning the Vietnam War decisively by every conceivable measure. That's not just my view. That was the view of our enemy, the North Vietnamese government officials. Victory was apparent when President Nixon ordered the U.S. Air Force to bomb industrial and military targets in Hanoi, North Vietnam's capital city, and in Haiphong, its major port city. and we would stop the bombing if the North Vietnamese would attend the Paris peace talks that they had left earlier. The North Vietnamese did go back to the Paris peace talks, and we did stop the bombing, as promised. On January the 23rd of 1973, President Nixon gave a speech to the nation on primetime television, announcing that the Paris Peace Accords had been initialed by the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the accords would be signed on the 27th. What the United States and South Vietnam received in those accords was victory. At the White House, it was called VV Day, Victory in Vietnam Day. The U.S. backed up that victory with a simple pledge within the Paris Peace Accords, saying should the South require any military hardware to defend itself against any North Vietnam aggression, we would provide replacement aid to the South on a piece-by-piece, one-to-one replacement, meaning a bullet for a bullet, a helicopter for a helicopter, for all things lost, replacement. The advance of communist tyranny had been halted by those accords. Then it all came apart, and it happened this way. In August of the following year, 1974, President Nixon resigned his office as a result of what became known as Watergate. 3 months after his resignation came the November congressional elections, and within them the Democrats won a landslide victory for the new Congress. And many of the members used their new majority to defund the military aid that the United States had promised, peace for peace, breaking the commitment that we made to the South Vietnamese in Paris to provide whatever military hardware the South Vietnamese needed in case of aggression from the North. Put simply and accurately, a majority of Democrats of the 94th Congress did not keep the word of the United States. On April the 10th of 1975, President Gerald Ford appealed directly to those members of the Congress in an evening joint session televised to the nation. In that speech, he literally begged the Congress to keep the word of the United States. But as President Ford delivered his speech, many of the members of the Congress walked out of the chamber. Many of them had an investment in America's failure in Vietnam. They had participated in demonstrations against the war for many years, and they wouldn't give the aid. On April the 30th, South Vietnam surrendered, and re-education camps were constructed, and the phenomenon of the boat people began. If the South Vietnamese had received the arms that the United States promised, would the result have been different? It already had been different. The North Vietnamese leaders admitted that they were testing the new president, Gerald Ford, and they took one village after another, then cities, then provinces, and our only response was to go back on our word. The U.S. did not resupply the South Vietnamese as we had promised. It was then that the North Vietnamese knew they were on the road to South Vietnam's capital city, Saigon, that would soon be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Former Arkansas Senator William Fulbright, who had been the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made a public statement about the surrender of South Vietnam. He said this, "I am no more distressed than I would be about Arkansas losing a football game to Texas." The U.S. knew that North Vietnam would violate the accords, and so we planned for it. What we did not know was that our own Congress would violate the accords, and violate them, of all things, on behalf of the North Vietnamese. That's what happened.